The fine showed up in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon, printed on stiff HOA letterhead like it was proud of itself. Excessive noise disturbance. $250 fine. Time stamped. Date noted. A warning that future violations could escalate to enforcement action. The kind of language meant to scare people into paying without thinking. Except there was one small problem. I wasn't home. Not asleep. Not in another room. Not quiet, but present. I was 3 states away on a work assignment, with hotel receipts, badge scans, and GPS logs to prove it. At first, I laughed. Loudly. The absurdity of it all almost felt impressive. I even assumed it was a clerical error. Maybe they mixed up houses. Maybe someone fat-fingered an address. I called the HOA office, calm and polite, expecting a quick correction. That's when I heard her voice. Sharp. Confident. Smug in a way only someone who's never been challenged can afford to be. She didn't ask questions. She didn't check records. She didn't even let me finish explaining before cutting in with, "The violation was verified." Verified by who? I asked. By me, she said. I personally documented it. That's when the humor drained out of the situation. I asked what kind of noise it was. Music? Party? Construction? She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to tell on herself, then said, "General disturbance. After-hours activity. After-hours activity at an empty house." I explained again that I wasn't home. I even offered to email proof. Her tone shifted instantly, from confident to irritated. She told me it didn't matter where I claimed to be because the noise was reported and enforcement had already been processed. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was personal. This particular HOA Karen had a reputation. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Clipboard always in hand. Always watching. Always documenting. She fined people for trash cans being visible for 5 minutes too long. She once threatened a lien over windblown leaves. And she hated my house because I wasn't easily intimidated and because I'd challenged her once before at a meeting. This fine wasn't about noise. It was about control. Instead of arguing, I asked one simple question. Who reported it? She smiled through the phone. I could hear it. That information is confidential. That sealed it. I didn't pay the fine. I didn't appeal through the HOA's internal process either, because I already knew how that would go. Denied. Delayed. Dismissed. So I did something else. I pulled my travel records. Hotel check-in timestamps. Worksite badge logs. Even my car's GPS history. Everything neatly lined up, down to the minute the noise supposedly occurred. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant. I simply asked for documentation because someone had officially claimed my house caused a disturbance while it was unoccupied. The officer on the phone paused longer than expected, then said, "Yeah, we'll look into that." The next day, a patrol car rolled into the neighborhood. That's when HOA Karen came outside. Clipboard in hand. Confident stride. Ready to assert authority. She didn't know yet that every assumption she'd made was about to collapse, one piece of verified evidence at a time. And she definitely didn't know that the police weren't there for me. They were there because someone had filed an official complaint that couldn't possibly be true. The next morning, I watched from a safe distance as the patrol car pulled slowly up the street, lights off but presence unmistakable. HOA Karen was already outside, clipboard clutched like a shield, glancing around as if she could somehow detect the officer's intentions through her sunglasses. I stayed inside, laptop open, documenting every move. No sudden gestures. No threats. Just patience. The officer stepped out, uniform crisp, demeanor calm. He didn't knock on my door. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he approached HOA Karen directly. "Hello," he said. "We're investigating a noise complaint from last night. Can you tell me what happened?" Her confidence wavered almost imperceptibly. Then came the first misstep. I documented it personally," she replied, voice tight, but trying to sound casual. The officer's eyebrows rose. "Documented?" he asked slowly. "Was anyone home?" The pause. That's all it took. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hands. Her mind raced. There was no script for this. She hadn't accounted for official verification, the one thing she couldn't control. I watched as the officer requested proof of occupancy. Key timestamps. Verification that someone was home at the reported time. HOA Karen fumbled. She tried to produce forms, notes, photographs, but nothing matched reality. Every piece of evidence was inconsistent. Her documentation was flimsy, unverified, and easily disproved. When the officer asked directly if she could guarantee the house was occupied during the alleged noise incident, her silence stretched for several seconds, a lifetime in the world of HOA enforcement. She glanced at the neighbors, probably hoping for support, but everyone stayed neutral, some craning necks to see what was happening. Finally, the officer turned to me. I presented my travel logs, hotel check-ins, GPS data, badge records from work, all timestamps perfectly aligned. He reviewed them, nodded, and explained calmly that this disproved any claim of a disturbance originating from my house. Legally, it was irrefutable. HOA Karen's complaint held zero weight. That's when her expression changed. Confident authority melted into disbelief, then panic. The kind of panic you can't fake. She looked down at the clipboard, then back at the officer, searching for some loophole, some technicality, anything to salvage the situation. There was nothing. Every claim she'd made crumbled in seconds. Neighbors began whispering among themselves. Some recorded the interaction on phones. The tension in the air was palpable, like watching a volcano about to erupt, only it was HOA Karen whose world was collapsing. She attempted a weak protest, stammering about procedures and reports, but the officer remained calm and factual, reiterating that the complaint was unverified and that her documentation could not be used to justify fines or enforcement. By mid-morning, the officer had explained the process. The HOA had no legal standing in this case. Any attempt to collect the fine could now be reported as harassment. The officer also suggested formal documentation of the incident in case of future attempts, a precaution I immediately took. HOA Karen slumped back onto her heels figuratively. The frozen confidence she wore like armor was gone. She lingered for a few minutes longer, trying to salvage face, then retreated indoors. Clipboard closed, lips pressed tight. From that moment, everything changed. The narrative that she controlled, the neighborhood gossip, the perception of authority, the quiet intimidation was shattered. One truth, one irrefutable record, and all her power evaporated. Later that evening, I reviewed the body cam footage and police notes. The officer had captured her reaction perfectly, stunned, unsure, and completely powerless. I realized then that HOA abuse, no matter how persistent or arrogant, can be countered with verifiable facts, patience, and calm strategy. And that was only the beginning. The ripple effects of this moment, the whispers, the neighbors' questions, the challenge to her authority, were about to escalate in ways HOA Karen never anticipated. The day after the police visit, HOA Karen tried to reclaim control. She walked the neighborhood with her clipboard, smiling forcibly, stopping at doors to ask about noise concerns and community satisfaction. But it was clear she was off balance. Neighbors, who had once nodded politely at her authority, now gave her wary looks. Some even whispered to each other, casting subtle glances toward their cameras. The balance of power had shifted. Her first mistake came when she tried to email me a follow-up notice, citing pending investigation. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I compiled the police report, my travel logs, timestamps, and a short statement detailing her previous harassment attempts. I sent it to the HOA board, the local police department, and the neighborhood association email list. Now the neighborhood could see the timeline, the evidence, and the fact that she had found someone who wasn't even home. The reaction was instantaneous. Emails and messages flooded the HOA inbox. Board members, who had previously relied on Karen's documentation, were now forced to answer questions they couldn't dodge. One board member even admitted in writing that Karen had acted independently and without authorization. It was a rare moment of transparency, forced, yes, but undeniable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched. A few residents admitted privately that they had been fined by Karen for minor violations, but had quietly paid to avoid confrontation. Suddenly, they realized she was acting outside authority and targeting individuals at whim. Conversations that had been hushed now became open debates. HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, were filling up. People wanted accountability. People wanted rules enforced fairly, not selectively. Karen, sensing her influence slipping, attempted intimidation. She sent letters threatening late fees, penalties, and possible liens. She called residents personally, claiming authority to enforce fines. But her previous blunders had been documented. Now, with a police report and verified timelines, her letters carried no weight. Residents politely but firmly ignored or challenged them. The turning point came when one neighbor, inspired by my evidence, recorded a direct confrontation. Karen approached their property, clipboard in hand, accusing them of violating HOA rules. They calmly referenced the police verification, the official logs, and even shared my travel proof. Karen's face went pale. She stumbled over words, realizing that her authority was now publicly questioned. By the end of the week, whispers had become discussions, discussions had become meetings, and meetings had become action. The HOA board convened an emergency session to discuss Karen's repeated abuses. They publicly admonished her, noting that any enforcement action she initiated without board approval was invalid. The message was clear. Karen was no longer in charge. Even after this public reprimand, Karen tried small maneuvers, filing minor complaints, sending ambiguous notices. But residents were ready. Cameras were pointed outward, conversations were documented, and everyone knew she could no longer act unchecked. The final blow came when she attempted one last intimidation attempt toward me directly. She drove up, clipboard ready, expecting compliance. Instead, I calmly handed her copies of the police report, timestamps of my absence, and a reminder that any further harassment would be legally actionable. Her eyes widened. She faltered. She turned around and left without another word. For the first time, the neighborhood felt free. Karen's reign of selective intimidation was over. Residents shared stories of her previous attempts, corroborating the narrative. People who had once felt powerless now understood that authority without accountability is meaningless. By the end of Section 3, Karen had learned a harsh truth. A combination of evidence, calm persistence, and community awareness could dismantle even the most confident and controlling HOA enforcer. The stage was now set for official consequences, legal follow-ups, and full community resolution. After Karen's public humiliation, the HOA board could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. Emails from residents poured in, documenting fines, threats, and previous intimidation tactics. The board convened an emergency session, this time with far more attendees than usual. Neighbors filled every available chair, some standing in the back, cameras discreetly recording. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation. Everyone knew Karen's authority was crumbling. The board president began the meeting nervously, attempting to explain past oversights. He claimed that Karen had acted independently and that the board had not authorized fines or enforcement actions. Several residents spoke up immediately, citing the police verification of my absence during the alleged noise incident. The room grew quiet as the board realized their credibility was under scrutiny. What had been internal oversight was now a public accountability issue. Karen tried to interject, holding up her clipboard, but her words faltered. She attempted to justify her actions by claiming procedural enforcement and community safety, but the evidence was clear. The police report, timestamps, travel logs, and email documentation completely contradicted her claims. One neighbor directly asked, "How can you enforce a fine when the accused wasn't even home?" The room erupted in murmurs and agreement. The board then voted unanimously to formally reprimand Karen. Her enforcement authority was immediately suspended, and she was barred from initiating any future fines without direct board approval. Additionally, the board committed to publishing official procedures, including clear verification protocols for noise complaints, ensuring no single individual could wield unchecked power again. Meanwhile, Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood. Residents who had previously quietly paid fines or endured harassment began sharing their own experiences. The collective stories painted a pattern of selective enforcement and intimidation that extended far beyond my case. It was no longer about one incident, it was about a systematic abuse of authority that needed correction. As the days passed, Karen attempted minor maneuvers to regain influence. She sent ambiguous emails, dropped by doors under the guise of routine inspection, and subtly suggested continued monitoring. But the community had changed. Cameras were pointed outward, residents were vigilant, and each attempt was documented and shared with the board. Even minor overreaches were immediately questioned. Her intimidation tactics lost all effect. Meanwhile, the police remained in the background, monitoring the situation. They confirmed that no complaints could be enforced without proper verification. Any further attempts to fine residents improperly could result in official legal action. Karen's previous confidence, built on the assumption that no one would challenge her, had been shattered. By the end of Section 4, Karen's influence was effectively neutralized. The board had implemented new transparency policies, the community was more alert, and residents had collectively reclaimed authority over their neighborhood. It was a complete reversal. The same woman who once struck fear into neighbors now found herself powerless, her actions documented and exposed, and her reputation permanently damaged. The stage was set for the final resolution, official consequences, restored trust, and a neighborhood that had learned an unforgettable lesson about vigilance, accountability, and the limits of unchecked authority. With Karen's authority stripped and the HOA board implementing new procedures, life in the neighborhood began to settle, but it wasn't the same calm as before. It was a calm built on awareness, vigilance, and hard-earned respect for rules that were enforced fairly, not arbitrarily. Residents no longer blindly accepted fines or intimidation. They asked for verification, documented interactions, and looked out for one another. Silence was no longer an option. I returned home, finally able to relax without the looming threat of an unjust fine. The house was quiet, yet it felt safer than ever. My travelogues and police report had not only cleared my name, but also set a precedent. HOA authority cannot overstep verified boundaries. The knowledge of community oversight and legal accountability had permanently changed the dynamic. HOA Karen's reign of fear was officially over, and her attempts to regain influence had failed spectacularly. Neighbors approached me and shared stories of their own experiences with Karen. People who had quietly complied in the past now felt empowered to speak out. Conversations that had been hushed for years became discussions, and discussions led to collective action. Security cameras were installed, policies were posted publicly, and the neighborhood began to function as a unified, accountable community rather than a collection of isolated homes vulnerable to arbitrary fines. The HOA board, for the first time, faced ongoing scrutiny. Meetings were well attended, questions were asked, and accountability became the new standard. Karen's attempts to intimidate residents without board approval were now impossible. She had lost not just credibility but also the trust and compliance that had allowed her to enforce rules selectively. Residents had learned a crucial lesson: authority is earned, and it must be transparent and verifiable. Even I noticed a subtle shift in my own approach. I no longer ignored notices automatically, nor did I assume authority figures were always right. Verification, documentation, and calm persistence became the guiding principles, not just for HOA disputes, but for everyday life. It was a lesson hard-won through confrontation, evidence, and the willingness to challenge unchecked power. By the end of the ordeal, the neighborhood was stronger. Residents looked out for each other, communication was open, and the HOA operated with clear oversight. HOA Karen, once feared for her arbitrary fines and aggressive enforcement, had been exposed, documented, and neutralized. Her power evaporated because the community refused to remain silent, because truth and evidence prevailed, and because ordinary people, armed with patience, documentation, and courage, refused to be bullied. In the end, the lesson was simple yet profound. Authority without accountability can be dangerous, But when a community stands together, verifies facts, and refuses to be intimidated, even the most confident enforcers can be stopped. HOA Karen had underestimated her neighbors, and the neighborhood had learned that vigilance, calm strategy, and persistence are more powerful than fear.